The Center for Early Childhood Education at Eastern Connecticut State University presents Early Childhood Insights, an audio podcast series featuring interviews with experts on topics of interest to early childhood professionals.
Hello, and welcome to Early Childhood Insights. I'm Julia DeLapp, Program Coordinator for the Center for Early Childhood Education. Today, we will be talking with Dr. Patricia Ramsey about cultural influences in children's play. Dr. Ramsey is a professor of psychology and education at Mount Holyoke College. One of her areas of expertise is how children develop early attitudes about gender, race, and social class, and how teaching from a multicultural perspective affects children's early awareness and attitudes about groups of people that are unfamiliar to them. She is the author of a number of books on this topic, including Teaching and Learning in a Diverse World, Multicultural Education for Young Children. Welcome, Dr. Ramsey. Let's get started. What do early childhood professionals need to know about the cultures of the children in their classrooms?
One of the most important things is that you understand the values of the culture and the priorities of the parents and the child-rearing goals of the parents in the community. Because with that information, you will understand what the parents are trying to do. For example, in middle-class American families, often they value individualism and individual achievement, and therefore encourage their children to compete and to be self-sufficient and to learn to grow away from the family, to be able to live on their own. Whereas cultures where collectivism and family relationships is the real value, children are encouraged to collaborate and cooperate and to stay with their families as opposed to leave home, and that will affect how children play. Some children from a more individualistic culture may prefer to spend time alone. They may prefer to spend time doing competitive activities. They may be more caught up in individual achievement in smaller groups, maybe more exclusionary activities, whereas children raised in a more collective and collaborative culture may emphasize inclusion and play in larger groups and be less concerned with the competitive aspect. It's also important to understand that cultures are constantly evolving, and so what's happening in that culture today may not be what's happening tomorrow, and to not see it as static. Well, all people from this particular country act this way, because first of all, there's many individual differences within cultures. You can't assume a child is going to be a certain way because she's Chinese American or comes from France. There are enormous individual variations within cultures, and cultures are always changing as they come in contact with each other. So you may often see, and typically, children will be in cultures, maybe quite traditional cultures, but they may be enacting television characters, Power Rangers and that kind of thing, with a slightly different twist to it, because they're being exposed to these other cultures as well as their own culture. And the culture is constantly evolving as that happens.
How can early childhood professionals begin to understand cultural differences?
Well, first I think you should be sure to understand the cultures, and not just the surface, as we mentioned before, not just the artifacts, not just the cooking, not just the clothing, but really try to understand the values of the culture, because that underlies a lot of the things that you might be bringing into the classroom. But really immersing yourself in the culture, going to community events, spending time with parents, asking parents about what they want for their children, reading the local newspapers, or whatever you can do to really try to get a feel for what the culture is about, that would be a much better grounding than simply following what you happen to see the parents doing.
Can you talk about how culture influences children's play?
Well, children tend to imitate the roles that they see adults play. So if your child is being raised in the rural area, they may be enacting farming roles, taking care of animals, driving tractors. In a city, children being raised in the city may be driving taxis and buses and enacting those kinds of roles. Very often in suburban areas, you see lots of children being the soccer moms. They'll be driving cars and playing on their cell phones at the same time. So the actual roles that they play are, in fact, something that may vary across cultures. Many times those roles have the same themes underlying it, family themes, fear, death, being lost, that kind of those sort of dramatic themes that children are expressing, that many children are experiencing in their lives, but the way they're enacted may be somewhat different. But often the underlying emotional interest is the same. Another way that cultures differ is the level of expressiveness that's allowed, or encouraged. That for some children, some cultures, the restraint is very important, and learning to mask your feelings. is a priority. Other cultures, it's to be very expressive. And so teachers need to understand how what may appear to be sort of rambunctious or aggressive in one classroom may not be in that classroom. However, that might be somewhat frightening or off-putting to children who are used to much more restraint in their culture.
What can teachers do to create a classroom environment that reflects the cultural diversity within our society?
Probably it's best to talk about cultures that are represented in the classroom rather than bringing in cultures that the children have no basis of firsthand knowledge. Now, in some cases where the classroom is extremely homogeneous and you really want the children to stretch past their knowledge of what the community that they're growing in, then there's some reason to do that. But then try to bring it in a way that really connects with what they understand. So, for instance, you might bring in information about families so that they can tie that in with their own family, but then see pictures and read books about how other families live, but always trying to make sure that they understand the similarities between the groups. It's also very important to involve the families into the activities. That it's much more meaningful if you have families bring in special objects that mean a lot and can explain a lot about the culture than for you to simply bring in something that you may not know very much about. Often teachers will have parents, families make posters about their lives with photographs and objects that, again, will explain their culture in a way that's very personal, very meaningful. And the children really understand that because they can see it's their friend they're talking about, not just some sort of abstract cultural information. You can also bring in cultural differences with books and puzzles and songs and learning words in different languages, but it's very important that you don't do it in a superficial, sort of touristy way, that you connect whatever you're bringing in with real lives and real people, and also that you explain the underlying values, because otherwise it'll just be these sort of superficial drops of information that children will be learning that may, in fact, even reinforce stereotypes or and certainly will give them only a very superficial idea about the culture. So, for instance, if you have a book that represents another culture, don't just read the story and drop it. You can build around it with doing stuff in the pretend area. You can do art projects along with it. You can do songs with it. And try as much as you can to bring in people who can speak to that culture. So it's not just an abstract culture, but something where they really understand. Another caution that's important, and one I have to say I learned painfully, is when you're bringing in cultural information and you're not as familiar with it, be sure that you don't do something that's going to insult or hurt people. Often what we see as cultural artifacts and rituals, we may not understand that many of them are very sacred and very important, and that really it's an insult to some groups to be doing things that, for instance, once in our preschool we did sand paintings based on a Navajo tradition, and then later found out that that was really sacrilegious, that we should not, as non-Navajo and as children, should not have been doing that, and that it was a painful lesson, but one that was important, and therefore it's important to try to be sure that you really understand what it is you're doing so that you don't make these kinds of errors.
This concludes this episode of Early Childhood Insights. Thank you, Dr. Ramsey, for talking with us today. And thanks to all of you for listening. You can watch a video that includes a portion of this discussion and footage from early childhood classrooms on iTunes U or by visiting our website.
This has been a presentation of the Center for Early Childhood Education at Eastern Connecticut State University. For more information about the Center for Early Childhood Education, please visit our website at www.easternct.edu/CECE. Make sure to subscribe to this feed to get more audio podcasts in this series as they become available.